Sean todos muy bienvenidos a esta casa. Quiero dar también una especial bienvenida a nuestros 8 escritores invitados que intervendrán esta tarde. El encuentro tendrá 2 sesiones. La primera, que será moderada por Nicholas Loffin, tiene el título de Secretos íntimos del pueblo caribeño, en la que los autores Kevin Harrett Hossein, Ingrid Persaud y Safiya Sinclair explorarán cómo las relaciones íntimas de familiares y amantes se van construyendo dentro de las tensiones y conflictos de sociedades bajo presión. Desde la Trinidad de los años posteriores a la Segunda Guerra Mundial a la Jamaica actual, estos autores cuestionan los lugares comunes sobre el Caribe. En la segunda sesión, moderada por la profesora Esperanza Cerdá Redondo y denominada Autorretrato como poema, los autores Jason Allen Paysant, Anthony Banning Capildeo y Hannah Love hablarán de cómo los poemas les van conformando como personas a medida que los escriben. El encuentro de hoy prolonga el interés de la Casa de América por la divulgación de la literatura del Caribe. Así lo confirman la visita en el año 2001 del maestro Derek Walcott, Premio Nobel de Literatura de 1992, y un encuentro de autores del Caribe que tuvo lugar en esta casa en noviembre de 2001. Derek Walcott, el poeta del lenguaje y el océano, como tan bellamente lo calificó el Premio Nobel Joseph Brodsky, participó en el ciclo de la Casa de América La poesía tiene la palabra. En aquella ocasión, el poeta, además de ofrecer una lectura de sus poemas, analizó sus temas literarios, su trayectoria y los distintos procedimientos a la hora de crear. Y el anterior encuentro Voces del Caribe contó con las intervenciones de Antonio Benítez Rojo, de Cuba, Cynthia MacLeod, de Surinam, Caril Phillips, de la isla de San Cristóbal, en las Antillas, Giselle Pinot, de Guadalupe, o de Sergio Ramírez, de Nicaragua, entre otros escritores de la región. Quiero agradecer la presencia de todos ustedes en este nuevo encuentro de escritores caribeños que, de seguro, contribuirá a estrechar los lazos entre nuestros países y a ampliar el ámbito de nuestras letras. Termino agradeciendo el trabajo de interpretación del inglés al español que tendremos esta tarde, por parte de las intérpretes doña Susana Millaruelo y doña Susana Pinazo, del Departamento de Traducción e Interpretación del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores de España. Muchas gracias y espero que disfruten esta actividad.
Muchas gracias, director. A continuación tiene la palabra Marina Salandi Brown, presidenta de Bocas Lit Festival.
Muchas gracias. Y muy buenas tardes a todos. I'm going to speak in English, but I like to speak Spanish too. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Many thanks to Casa América, to Moises Morera and Ambassador León de la Torre for making this evening possible, and to Ana Maria Rodriguez Arias and the Casa América team. There are other people to thank, but first let me give you a very brief context for this evening's event. We're here to introduce to you the vibrant new world of contemporary Caribbean Anglophone literature. Just 14 years ago, when Bocas Lit Fest started, the first literary festival in the Southern Caribbean, and the leading prize for Caribbean literature, the OCM Bocas Prize, we had 2 living Nobel laureates, the poet Derek Walcott and V.S. Naipaul, the prose writer. Several other writers of their generation were also successful in the 1950s to the 1970s, all men. Published in Britain, and many were also widely translated. However, after the 1970s, the numbers of published Caribbean writers dwindled. People were writing, but they often lacked publishing opportunities, so that in 2010, there were comparatively few published Anglophone Caribbean writers compared to 50 or 60 years before. Our dedicated program of literary development a strategy of bringing Caribbean literature together, and much international collaboration have helped to grow a new generation of prize-winning writers, many of them women. You will hear some of them tonight, some very fine writers. An important next step is to have our writers' work widely translated, which is happening, but very rarely into Spanish, something that really needs to change. As we've heard, this is not the first time that non-Hispanophone Caribbean writers are appearing in Casa América. As you heard, in 2001, there was the Voces del Caribe, led by the British Council with French, Dutch, and French partners. I'm very delighted that David Codling, whose brainchild it was, has come here all the way from Scotland. He's been one of our most steadfast partners. And Isabel Hernandez-Diaz, who managed that event, is also here. Thank you both for your generous advice. I hope that we can work with the Casa América to ensure that it won't be another 23 years before the next Anglophone Caribbean literary event happens in this very beautiful building. Thank you to Secret Kingdom Bookstore, the wonderful English language bookstore in Barrios de las Letras. If you don't know it, you must discover it. They will continue to stock Caribbean titles, another important piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And they have copies tonight of all our writers' books for sale. We would definitely not be here without the active intervention of the former Spanish ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago, Fernando Nogales Alvarez. Huge thanks to you. Thanks to the former Deputy Ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago, Oriol Solar Pardel, for your intervention and all your guidance. And to the Hollick Family Foundation and Lady Kate Gavron in Britain, who made this event financially possible. Thanks to Instituto Franklin and to Universidad de Alcalá for the participation of Professor Esperanza Tardar Redondo, who will moderate the poetry panel that follows this one, which is led by Nicholas Laughlin, himself a poet and the festival and program director of the Bocas Lit Fest. I wish also to thank our interpreters. I hand over to Nicholas now to introduce the writers, but please join me in saying huge thanks to all of them who've come from their bases in Trinidad, the United States, and Britain. Please give them a round of applause.
All right. Am I switched on, everyone? Right, great. Buenas tardes, todos y todas, and English from here on. I'm delighted to be here this evening. I'm looking at the audience and I'm wondering how many of you are from the Caribbean or have been to the Caribbean. We've got some hands. Okay, so we have a home audience here. I'm thrilled. We've set ourselves a ridiculous challenge this evening because we have 6 amazing writers, 3 up here and 3 who you'll hear shortly. And in the space of just 2 hours, we're going to try to do justice to their writing. It's impossible. I don't know what we were thinking. But I just want to start by saying, as many of you probably know, all the writers here this evening have roots in either Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica. And as most of you probably know, both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago have a historic relationship, and indeed a colonial relationship with Spain that goes back centuries. Jamaica was a Spanish colony until 1655. Trinidad was a Spanish colony until 1797. So we have that long and contentious connection. And what we're hoping, as Marina says, is that by bringing these writers here, this is just the first introduction or maybe a reintroduction to the incredible writing that's coming out of the Caribbean region and the Caribbean diaspora. Let me just introduce the writers now very quickly and tell you very briefly about the books they'll be reading from this evening. I'm going to do what the young people do and read this off my phone, so let's see how that goes. I'm going to start at the far end of the table and work my way closer. So Kevin Jared Hussein at the far end of the table is a writer from Trinidad and Tobago. He's the author of the novel Hungry Ghosts, which we'll hear from this evening. Hungry Ghosts was the winner of the OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature in the fiction category. That's the prize that our festival administers. And also very recently the prize of the winner of the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction. He's published 2 previous novels. He's also a past winner of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize. And he used to be a science teacher, but now he's more or less a full-time writer. Next to Kevin is another Trinidadian, the one who's currently living in London. That's Ingrid Persaud. Her most recent novel, which is on the table in front of her, is called The Lost Love Songs of Boise Sing, published a few months ago. The previous one is called Love After Love, and it was the winner of the Costa Book Award for Best First Novel. Ingrid, like Kevin, is also past winner of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize, as well as the BBC National Short Story Prize. I introduce her to people often saying that she used to be a lawyer and an artist, but she's made it clear to me she never actually practiced law. She maybe studied law just for the intellectual challenge of it. But as Kevin brings his knowledge as a science teacher to his writing, and Ingrid brings her legal and visual training to her writing as a novelist. And immediately next to me is Sophia Sinclair, who is from Jamaica, born in Montego Bay, but currently lives in the United States. Her most recent book is a memoir called How to Say Babylon, which was the winner of this year's OCM Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, both for the best non-fiction book and the overall winner. And it is a finalist as well for prizes like the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction and the National Book Critics Circle Award in the US.
I won that one.
Sorry?
I
Won the National Book Award. Winner, a round of applause. Winner of the National Book Award. I'm clearly reading a slightly outdated bio. But I wanted to say, though, that her previous book was a collection of poems called Cannibal. Sophia is, I would say, primarily a poet, and you can tell from reading. The prose she writes is a poet's prose. That's a compliment.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, yeah. And her book Cannibal was also a winner of the OCM Bocas Prize, in that case in the poetry category, as well as various other prizes and shortlists and so on. So these are three writers who are doing some of the most interesting and acclaimed work, I would say, in the English language that is being published in present times. They all happen to have roots in the Caribbean. Kevin's book, Hungry Ghosts, is a novel that is set in Trinidad in the period just after the Second World War. And I don't know how many of you will be familiar with that context. It's set in a rural village in Trinidad that's mostly inhabited by Indo-Trinidadian people who are descended from Indian immigrants who came from India in the 19th century. And the time just after the Second World War is really crucial. That was a time of great ferment and challenge for Trinidad as a colony, as it was then, 2 decades before independence. The Second World War, brought a great number of American soldiers, sailors, military to be based in Trinidad. That triggered a whole period of rapid social evolution and liberation, not all of which has trickled down to the village that Kevin's book is set in. So it's set in a time where there are very deep divisions of class, of ethnicity, of faith, of gender. And a lot of that is at the heart of his book, which we'll hear from shortly. Ingrid's The Lost Love Songs of Boise Sing is a fictionalized version of a very real person. Boise Sing was a real character, a real individual, who was born around the start of the 20th century and died in the 1950s. Didn't just die, but was hanged because he was a famous gangster. He is, the best analogy maybe is he was almost the Al Capone of Trinidad and Tobago, a notorious character that parents would frighten their children with. And Ingrid has done something very interesting with his story in the way she tells it, which I won't give away for now. We'll get to it. And Sophia's memoir, How to Say Babylon, it's a personal memoir of herself and her family. And as we'll hear shortly, it is really a story about, in many ways, finding herself, understanding who she is and wants to be, but in the context of having been brought up in a fairly conservative, fairly strict Rastafari family in Jamaica. I won't give you the potted history of Rastafari because I'm not the best person to do that, but it's a story about a young woman who, in order to become the person, to fulfill the potential for what she could be, has to, in a sense, break with her past, break with her upbringing, break with her father. And in the course of that, the book also talks about her discovering her interest in writing, her literary talent. It's also the process of becoming a writer. So I've told you a bit about the 3 books. More will come out in the conversation. But I want to start somewhere maybe a little obvious, which is with the titles of the 3 books. They all have great titles, very memorable titles, but also titles that are integral to the books. They do a lot of the work of creating the meaning, the effect of what you get from reading the book. So I want to ask them all to tell us a little bit about that. Kevin, let's start with you. Maybe there are some practicing Buddhists in the audience who know what a hungry ghost is, but tell us why the book has that title and what is a hungry ghost.
figure in Buddhism and Hinduism. And if you were to picture what a hungry ghost is, it's a small figure, but it has a very small mouth, a very thin neck, but a very large belly. And it has a ravenous appetite that it cannot satisfy, but it cannot eat. And I thought it would be an interesting metaphor or comparison to what Trinidad would have been, my characters in the novel would have been in the 1940s, where they would have been, as Nicholas said, the Americans brought with them riches and a sort of splendor, and they brought with them the notion of the American dream that the locals simply could not achieve. So the hungry ghost, which is the figure in Buddhism, but it also represents wanting things that you simply cannot have.
Well, I know the passage that you're going to read for us, the excerpt from the book that you're going to read, actually refers to the hungry ghost. So perhaps now is a good time to hear a little bit of the texture of the book before we move on to the other two.
Yes. At times, Shweta believed she was missing some part that would make her a good mother. She supposed many mothers became afflicted with such an emotion after losing a child. There was little understood about malady and little consequence to violence in these parts, so it was not unusual for a mother to cremate her own child. A section of river was black with the ashes of babies. Shweta's daughter Hema among them. A bug in the water had killed the little girl. It swam into her, never came out. That's how it was told. But who told it like that? The nurses? A pundit? Ruckman, the elder who lived 3 doors over? Everything back then a fever dream. A hand shoved a bottle of Desi Daru rum into her mouth the day the body burned. Voices in her ear. Don't worry, gal, let that one sleep. Your husband gonna give you a next one just now, just now. Shweta drank and wept and vomited and never spoke her daughter's name again. There was no memento, nothing left behind for this world but memories bedimmed by unspoken sorrow. But more than a decade later, her daughter's name still resounded. It resounded that very minute. It was a name that neither she nor her husband Hans had uttered, even to each other since that day. And the fact that the rest of the barrack had seemed to forget her existence cemented that Krishna, her brother, would never know that he once had a sister. Thoughts, years later, weren't prepared to be full thoughts, only fragments of malady and mortality. That skin still looks as warm and brown as the final minute of life surges within it, that the eyes are the first to go, that death is more concerned with stillness than sleep. How the dead wilt in one's arms, angling downward to the ground, as if impatient to melt into the earth. How old was her daughter when she died? 10 months? 11? Nobody could remember. Ruckman had made a mound of clay in the middle of Hans and Shweta's room and told Shweta that her daughter's spirit would dwell there, fluctuating between troubled sleep and terrified consciousness. Before Hema's passing, Shweta believed in the deities, but not in rakshasas and jinns, not in the way the elders like Ruckman did. But the old lady Ruckman was the only one she felt she could be sincere with about her grief. The others either gave her rum or told her to focus on having the next child. Krishna was there within the year, but the sorrow lingered. Ruckman's skin was fair, almost diaphanous. Always a small woman, she'd shrunk a few inches since Shweta's time as a little girl. Was as if life had whittled down her bones over the years. She draped a yellow dupatta over her head to hide a balding spot, spoke in resonant purrs, the words almost evaporating as they reached the air. The old woman communicated by touch, liked to caress the hands of those she held in serious conversation, held a strange electricity in her fingertips, which she transferred to the spines of others, refused to do so for men out of respect for her husband, Murali. Despite her religious convictions, she listened without preaching, without interrupting. Her voice garnered a young confidence whenever she relayed her knowledge about spirits and gods. Rukmin made a batch of rice balls for Shweta and told her that it was to feed her daughter's spirit, now a preta, a hungry ghost. Her daughter's belly had expanded to twice and thrice the size of her head. Ghosts always hunger for company, and so bring other ghosts with them. 6 rice balls were to be offered to these other ghosts, 10 for the hungriest one, the preta. Shweta was to abstain from any form of pleasure or grooming. Rukmin was firm about this. No brush should touch her hair, no water should touch her face, no bed should touch her trunk, and finally, no man should touch her flesh. In her mourning, there was no room for reluctance. Shweta decided that she would adhere to the instructions. She slept outside in the cold night and came down with pneumonia. 3 days in, without saying a word, Hans kicked the clay mound and tossed the rice balls to the blackbirds. The only words he uttered that day were in great anger to Rukmin. "You trying to kill my wife?" He nursed his wife back to health, boiled eucalyptus oil in a pot and let her breathe the steam, rubbed her back as she hacked globs of orange phlegm onto the same spot where the clay mound had been. He laid her naked body on a blanket quilted of his merinos and cleaned her with a sponge. Any time Shweta thought back to it, she could only remember helplessness, bitterness. She wanted to have the pneumonia. She wanted to stay sick. And her husband was robbing her of it. It felt right to deteriorate, even if just for a while. But she could never say such a thing aloud, especially not to the other women. What a difficult wife, they would say.
Thank you, Kevin. Ingrid, what I really like about the title of your book, The Lost Love Songs of Boise Sing, is that it kind of sets up the reader a little bit. It sets up an expectation, which it then immediately and very fascinatingly defies, because you think you're going to be hearing in the voice of Boise Sing. And in fact, there are 4 narrators of the book, but Boise Sing isn't one of them. Tell us where that title comes from, why they are love songs, why they are lost, and why you chose to write the book in this way.
Sure. Thank you. Before I start, though, I just have to say that reading was so moving. I've heard you read lots of different times, and I still can't get over how he conveys loss. And I don't know if there's a word in Spanish for a parent who loses a child. In English, there isn't. You know, you're just kind of set adrift like this, and for a man, you capture it rather well. But I'm here to talk about another man, Boise Sing. But I'm also not here to talk about Boise Sing. So Boise Sing, as you heard earlier, was this notorious character somewhere between Blue Bed and Al Capone. He was a serial murderer, a pimp, a gambling king. If there was anything bad going, he did it. Actually, he also did preaching for 2 years, as one does. And there are lots of myths around him. I remember it being a tool of parental control. So, if I didn't eat my cereal, my parents would say, Boise Sing going to come and get you. And if I later on, stayed out too late, stay out late now, see if Boise Sing don't come and get you. So Boise Sing was this, overarching evil in my childhood. And so I suppose I was always meant to write this book to exorcise these ghosts. But what struck me in doing the research was how we construct myths and lone characters. So Boise Sing appears out of nowhere, and his success appears to be solely his doing. And I just didn't believe that. I was sure that there were others. And of course they are but they have not been written into history. They're just small sidelines about them. So I decided to find out more. And I had to imagine these lives. So this is the story of reclaiming the women in Boise's life. I use Boise's lifetime as the hook, the timeline, but he never gets a voice. His wife, his lover, his baby mother, and a shopkeeper he works with are the ones who tell the story. So that's why it's the lost love songs of Boise Sing.
And I think the passage you're going to read for us, if I'm correct, it's one of Rosie's.
I'm going to read two bits. The first is, and this is a lovely book from our bookseller. So the first one looks like a newspaper article that's quite, kind of solid from the archives. It is indeed made up entirely, and the reporter is a combination names of two of my friends and their dog. So I'll read the fictitious newspaper article and then a little bit in the voice of Rosie, one of the characters. The Trinidad Monitor, Port of Spain, Trinidad, British West Indies, Friday, 23rd August, 1957. The End of Boise by Gerard Max Davidson, staff reporter. Knowing the end was coming, John Boise Sing, the Raja, who once controlled illegal activities in Port of Spain and in the Gulf of Paria, said, "I have lived. I have seen things and I have done things. Now I must go, but I am innocent of this crime. I always tried to help people, and that is how I got a great deal of my troubles. That is what has me here now." He asked to go first, but on 20th August 1957 was made to wait an hour until 8 o'clock after Bolan Ramkissoon's body was cut down and laid aside. A Catholic priest, Father Tiene, who asked for his name not to be reported, walked him to the gallows. Wearing prison-issue white cotton pajamas, the Raja met death chanting, "My Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy, my Jesus mercy." As prescribed, the hangman was paid $77 per man for his duties. A Gregorio Brothers van took the body from the jail to the General Hospital and then to the St. James Cemetery, where Boise was laid to rest in a crude white pine, unpainted coffin, his name written on top in chalk. None of his close relatives, seen visiting the condemned man in the days leading up to the hanging, were present at the graveside. Rosie. While the shop ain't busy, I told myself, "Rosie girl, drink a cup of coffee, tea, and check the papers. Nobody's coming for a shot of rum this hour. And on the dry goods side is always one person throughout the day." I sit down good when I spotted the wretch. Man dead and he's still making front page. And look at that. Boise playing innocent down to the end. Exactly who that Bajon think he fooling? At least now he's in the ground, we might get an ease from seeing him all the time. Something else will take over the news. Every night the Lord seen me on my knees begging that boy doesn't fill the gap he's left. They say goat don't make sheep. Well, this is one time I hope they're wrong, yes? A sudden hard rain made me put down the papers. 2 school children, a girl about 7 and a boy child a little younger, rushed to shelter under the shop awning. The way she held on to the boy, I could tell she was a good big sister. I called to them. Come inside and don't get wet. You see how the sun's still shining? Rain go past now for now. They came and stood by the door. I smiled. Come in, I don't bite. The girl pulled her brother where they were safe from the pelting rain. You know that when sun shining and rain falling, monkey does be marrying. Either that or the devil and his wife fighting. Poor children looked at me as if I was about to gobble them up. A good 5 minutes hadn't passed and the rain stopped just so. The two bolted. I watched them speed off, holding hands tight. Steam rose from the hot pitch, releasing a sickly sweet smell that made me feel slightly nauseous. Then something happened. Maybe it was the pitch smell, or the little boy and girl holding hands, or just reading the death notice. Could be all three. Suddenly I realized what was bothering my head. I was thinking of Boise. What's that game children play? The one with 2 circles, holding hands and singing in turns. Ah, yes. In a fine castle, do you hear my CCO? In a fine castle, do you hear my CCO? Without missing a beat, the second circle would reply. Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my CCO? Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my CCO? What song did we throw back? Ah, yes. We want one of them, do you hear my CCO? We want one of them, do you hear my CCO? From the side, under a laden guava tree, a boy, had to be less than 10, was watching us playing in the road. Our eyes made 4. Without words, he knew that we coolie orphans, holding hands while singing louder and louder, had room for other unclaimed children. Which of us do you want? Do you hear my CCO? I broke hands mid-song so he could join my circle. He came forward slowly and gave me his hand. That little hand squeezed mine just a bit tighter than the others. I squeezed back. Which of us do you want? Do you hear my CCO? A scared boy, out on the road by himself, nobody looking to see what he was doing. That barefoot, raggedy child grew into John Boise Singh, the Raja. How that happened? Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid. Okay, Sophia, Babylon means something in the Bible. It means something to historians and archaeologists, but it means something very specific in Jamaica, and in particular in Rastafari. So tell us that. Explain that to us, and what is Babylon, and why this particular title for this particular story?
Sure. I want to say first, hi everyone, good evening. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you for coming. And it's lovely to hear Kevin and Ingrid, both you read. And Ingrid, you have a wonderful singing voice. Yeah, you know, one of the things I knew that I wanted to explore in writing the memoir is that so many people, I think when they think of Jamaica, they think Rastafari is the thing that defines Jamaica. And I think most people who read the book would be surprised to find that the Rastas in Jamaica are historically a persecuted minority, that they're 1% or less of the Jamaican population, about 100,000 or so. And so when the Rasta movement began in the early 1930s, it began as an anti-colonial movement. It began as a way for the black citizens of Jamaica who did not have all of their freedoms to coalesce around this movement of black liberation and black unification. But this was seen as a threat to the British government, which was still in colonial rule in Jamaica. And, the Rastas were constantly targeted by the army, by the police. They were the outcasts in Jamaica. They were kicked out of their homes, turned away from their families. They were forbidden from having jobs, forbidden from walking along the beach sides that were being developed for tourists. My siblings and I were actually among the first Rasta children to be integrated into public schools in Jamaica in the late 80s and early 90s. And so a lot of the strife and struggle that the Rastafari faced from the government and from a lot of the actual citizens of the nation who are, very Christian, led them to see a kind of parallel in the way that Babylon is described in the Bible. So they kind of saw themselves as parallel to the Jewish people who faced a lot of forced exile and persecution in the Bible. And so this is kind of where the term Babylon came from. And the more that the government targeted them. For example, in the 1960s, we had a Prime Minister, Bustamante, who gave the order, "Bring me all Rastas, dead or alive." And this led to a weekend of terror in Jamaica where Rasta brethren from all across Jamaica were kind of rounded up. They were brought into jails. They were forcibly, their dreadlocks were forcibly cut, their beards were forcibly shorn. And this really made the Rastafari very paranoid of, I think, anything tied to these kind of oppressive systems. They call that Babylon. And so Babylon really represents anything that's tied to colonialism, imperialism, to racism, to slavery, to anything my father calls ism and schism. That's what they call Babylon. And so the title is really pointing to growing up in this very strict Rastafari household where this idea of Babylon really shaped so much of my life. Everything that my father thought was evil or anything that was against his own opinions, it was Babylon. And the book is a journey to me understanding all the different ways to say Babylon, what it means when you say it, and how eventually, Babylon came to me not just the things my father didn't like, but things that anything outside the gate became Babylon, and then anything outside the door became Babylon, and anything you didn't agree with became Babylon. And then finally, I found that my father looked at me and saw Babylon. And so the title and the book itself is a chronicle of my journey to all the different ways of education of what Babylon means when you say it.
And I think the passage that you're going to read for us is a really crucial one. It's a major turning point in the book. I won't say any more about it. I'll let you set it up. But yeah.
Okay.
Very, very powerful passage that marks an important turning point in I was going to say the character's life, but it's your
character.
Life.
It's me, yes.
Yeah. The book has the narrative thrust of the book is so novelistic that even though I know you wrote it and I know you personally, I still find myself sometimes thinking about the people as characters.
Yeah. I think that's a compliment. Sometimes my mother has come to some of my readings and people are, oh my God, it's like meeting my favorite characters, stepped out of my favorite novel. I'm like, okay. She's real though. So I'm gonna read this passage, and sorry if you haven't read the book, it's kind of a spoiler. When my father looked at me and saw Babylon, it's a spoiler to how we got there. But it really is one of the defining moments in my life, and in the book as well. And another thing I think that people don't realize when they think of dreadlocks, right? I think a lot of people are like, it's just a hairstyle, just a hairdo. But for the Rastafari, it's not just a hairstyle. It really represents like a sacred marker of your devotion to Rastafari. It represents, you know, your reverence to Jah and your purity and your holiness of wearing these dreadlocks. But for a long time when I wore the dreadlocks, you know, it began to feel like it didn't belong to me, that it was something that tethered me to my father's control and his view of the world, and also his view of the person he wanted me to be, the woman he wanted me to be, which was somebody that kind of lacked opinions, lacked autonomy, someone who wasn't in charge of her own dreams or desires or her own future. And so you know, when I began to think for myself, okay, if I go down this path and I follow all his rules, who will I be? And what I saw there was a woman that I didn't want to become, a silent woman, a bent and broken woman. And so I thought I need to cut her completely out of me. And I said to my mom, you know, Mom, I really just don't feel like I'm myself. I don't think I can go on like this. And she said to me simply, okay, my love, how can I help? And this is what happened next. Mom told me to hold down my head, and I held down my head. She asked me if I was ready, and I said yes. Beside me, the sea breeze made womanly shapes in the lace of my curtain, and no one among us spoke. I don't know who held the scissors or who made the first cut. All I heard were the hinges of the shears locking and unlocking, the blades cutting. And then long black reeds of hair came loose in their quick hands. My dreadlocks fell around me like ruined limbs. I closed my eyes then because I could not look at what I was losing. I had railed for so long and had not expected it to matter when the moment came. But now I found that it mattered a great deal. My throat burned with a peculiar remorse as all my dreadlocks fell away. For what was Medusa without her snakes? There was hair, so much hair, dead hair, hair of my gone self, wisps of spiderweb hair, old uniform lint hair, pillow sponge and tangerine strings hair, a whole life pulled itself up by my hair, the hair that locked the year I broke my tooth, hair that locked the day we caught cane ashes in the yard, hair of our lean years, hair of the fat, pollen of marigold's hair, my mother's aloe vera hair, my sister's weaving wild ixoras in my hair, the pull of the tides on our sea village hair, grits of sand hair, hair of salt tears, hair thick with the blood of my own cut wrists, hair of my binding, hair of my unbeautiful wanting, hair of his bitter words, hair of the cruel world, hair roping me to my father's belt, hair wrestling the taunts of bald heads in the street, hair of my lone self, hair wrapped atop the ghost woman in white's hair, red thread of hair, centuries of hair, galloping future of incorrigible hair, all cut away from me. When they were finished, my neck and head were so light they swung unsteady. The tethers had been cut from me, and I was new again, unburdened. Someone different, I told myself. A girl who could choose what happened next.
I think what that passage conveys very powerfully is that, you know, that's a moment of tenderness, it's a moment of courage, but it's also in some ways a moment of violence, because you know, cutting off the locks is something that is, it's almost like a necessary act of violence to release you, to free you into something else, to open another possibility. And I think that all three books, this is another thing they have in common, is that they're certainly, you know, Ingrid's book is about a gangster. She said he was, you know, a serial killer. He was famous for, you know, throwing people off a boat into the Gulf of Paria, never to be seen again. And Kevin, I think it's fair to say that certainly most of your writing that I have read has been fairly violent, never gratuitously, always because there's a reason for it. But I wanted to ask, maybe I want to tease out an idea here. The violence that the characters in Hungry Ghosts either may experience or may commit, or that simply exists in the society around them. Do you think? Yes, it is a legacy of colonialism, of the lives that the colonial enterprise made for them. But is it also part of an evolution towards something? Do you think that it's like almost like a necessary stage in becoming something else, or no?
That's many things in one that you asked me. So I'll tell a little story here. Hungry Ghosts was born from a story that my grandfather told me about his childhood. And he was telling me about the transition from when the British and the Dutch controlled the schooling system in Trinidad. And then at the time that Hungry Ghosts is set, the British were starting to move out of Trinidad, and they were passing power to the locals. So Trinidadian teachers, the Trinidadians were becoming the teachers. However, they could not control the students because they were so accustomed to having fair-skinned, white British teachers. And so what happened then, and this is a book that has no tangible villain really. I mean, there's bad people in it, but the villain is really the systems that are set up. So what happened after is that because the Trinidadians themselves could not control their Trinidadian children, their own students, they started wearing, and keep in mind Trinidad is a very hot country. The sun blazes down on us. So they started wearing suits to go to school with ties. And sometimes they would double up and they would try to look like how the British looked. And then they would bring whips with them. And that was the way in which they controlled the children. So what was ostensibly not very violent, because my grandfather told me that the British actually were very kind to them, but kind in a sort of deadly way. Where, if you did not obey, you would be expelled, or you would not be allowed certain treats during Christmas. If you had to convert to Christianity and so on. When the Trinidadians moved, they had to use violence against the children to get them to listen. And so a lot of, within this book, it is about, there's no British in this book. It's about Trinidadians turning on each other. These systems that some create to help control others. So I would not say it is an evolution. I would say that it is a remnant of what was left behind, an unfortunate remnant.
Yeah. Ingrid, Boise Sing was, it's easy to romanticize gangsters, right? That's why people like movies like The Godfather, that sort of thing. No, you haven't. What I'm saying is that's the kind of the natural temptation to make them into these kind of Robin Hood figures. Boise Sing is not that, and in fact, there are many parts of your book that are quite difficult to read. And I wondered, well, kind of two things. One, first, did your sense of who Boise Sing as a character is change in the process of writing about him, but writing about him through the voices and the consciousnesses of the women around him? That's the first thing. And secondly, your book is set at, it overlaps. It's not an exact overlap, but it overlaps with Kevin's, and it's setting in Trinidad at that era. Do you think there is something about that, was Boise Sing a product of his time, or was he a figure who could have lived at any time in any place, and was it was just his DNA, his personality that created him? Is there something about Trinidad in the 1930s, 40s that created a character like him?
So there's so many things, so many parts to your question, but actually...
Sorry, I keep asking 5-part questions.
Yeah, you're asking 5-part questions because you want to get it all in. But actually, the whole kind of character of the questions I take issue with.
Okay.
And the reason I do is because the book isn't about Boise Sing. It's about the women and the women's lives. So are these women's lives that have been reconstructed, are their reflection, are their sorrows, are their difficulties, is the violence that they meet a product of the time? And yes, it is. And that's what made it so difficult to write, because their choices were never going to be my choices. Yet I couldn't give them agency, which they wouldn't have had. So it was really difficult to be writing, particularly his baby mother, because this cruel man takes the child from her, and she bargains to get access to her child. And she stays, this very submissive character for the whole book. And she was a pain to write. I mean, because you just want to slap her, just like, get her back, leave the guy, take your baby. And she doesn't. And so understanding these choices, were difficult. His wife, as the wonderful surprise, she owned half of their family home, which was a huge thing to have negotiated for a woman. She was rather beautiful, and he knew that he was stepping up in life by marrying this, hot chick, as it were. And that's what she managed to get out of it. So I think, that was really interesting. And just to give you a little bit about Boise, because you have asked, did my opinion of Boise change in writing the book? Very much so. The more the more I touched Boise Sing's life and the people in it, the more it touched me. So I found, for example, well into the research, like draft 659, my mother just says one day, apropos nothing, she says, we related to Boise Sing. And I'm like, you didn't think to mention that I might have this link? And she's like, yeah, but is Pumpkin Vine relative? You see, is your grandmother, well, she cousin. You see, she cousin, but not on we side, on the other side. She cousin, daughter. No, is she cousin, sister, daughter, yes? I think it's that one. Anyway, she did marry Boise son. And that side of the family, well, we still know them now. I'm like, we are so not related. But nevertheless, I use that familial track to access Boise's grandchildren.
That's a very Trinidadian way of being related to someone, though.
Totally. And then, another time she said, this is again my mother, she said, well, I did see him preach, because he did come and preach under we shop. Well, first of all, I did not know we had owned a shop, and I felt disinherited. So, apparently, my great-grandmother had a shop, and Boise Sing would, he was an itinerant preacher, and he would just sort of come and take over. So when the parlor, as it was called, was closed, he came, and she says she remembers the feeling of anxiety, the seriousness of it all. So there's a lot of Boise that was just sitting at home,
Waiting for the writer to come
Waiting
along.
for the writer, but maybe just the last point. Why did my mother not tell me that when I'd been researching this damn book for 2 years? And I think the reason is that there's something about touching the someone who is a notorious gangster. We don't actually know how to position ourselves in relation to evil, as it were. And so somehow she could not negotiate this for quite some time. And she said to me, I don't understand why you want to write this, because, just by writing it, you're kind of associating with it. Mm-hmm. So that's Boise.
Okay. Sophia, I have not written a memoir, I don't know if I ever will. However, I've often noticed
Don't
that
recommend.
You don't recommend it? Okay. I'll never write a memoir. All my secrets will go to the grave. But I've often noticed that if I'm telling a story about something that happened to me many years ago, it can happen that in the telling, I understand what happened in a totally different way. I think I know what happened to me, and then just by trying to bring it across to someone else, I realize, wait, there's a nuance there, or there was another meaning, or there was another motive. And so what I want to ask you is, in the course of writing this story about not just yourself, but your father, your mother, your family, did something change in the way you understand your own story for yourself of how you grew up, or what or the way your family grew up?
That's a good question. I think the thing that changed the most, I would say, in the writing of the book is perhaps not an understanding of myself, but I think I had a deeper understanding of my parents, right? Because they were the ones, particularly my father, who was my connection to Rastafari. It was something he chose when he was 16 years old. But by the time I was born and we were growing up with him, it really was just rules that he had just, delivered to us. Like, these are the rules. This is what you have to do. Don't question. And so in writing the book, I really had to really pull at that thread and trace his decision to go into Rastafari. Like, I had to ask him all these questions about his youth and about his life that I didn't know before. And in many ways that humanized him to me in a way that he'd never been before, because he had always presented himself as this sort of larger than life, like, these are my rules, this, sort of Godhead figure. And in writing the book, he himself had never humanized himself to us. And so in writing, I had a more nuanced understanding of him, and also of my mother, who for a long time, growing up, she is a very patient, a very quiet person. And I am very much not that. And so even more so when I was, a teenager. And I really spent a lot of my adolescence kind of wanting her to act in ways that I think she should have acted, that I wanted her. I thought for a long time the way that her character or her silence was weakness. And it was in writing the book that I began to see all the moments of my life that was actually shaped and changed by my mother. Like, she's the one who gave me my love of literature. She's the one who handed me my first collection of poems. She's the one who really, I think, looked at her daughter and the way that she experienced the world and thought poetry might be a thing that will help me to experience the world. And she was right. And in writing the book, I really saw that my mother had always been strong. That what I'd always mistook for weakness was strength. And so I really, I came away with a sort of, I think, a new appreciation for both of my parents in the writing of the book, which I'm grateful for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in fact, you're talking about your mother. Just after where you stop reading that passage, there's a part where she basically says, "Don't worry, I will take his anger."
Yeah. Yeah.
So that strength is, and she says it in a very quiet sentence. She doesn't make a big production about it.
She never makes a big production. Unless she thinks, you're coming for her daughter.
Well,
sometimes she'll be at the readings, right?
No one come for Sophia
Don't
tonight.
come for me, unless I send for you. But sometimes she'll be in the front of the audience, and she will turn around and make sure, are they listening? You're listening to her? Are you here? Are you listening? Are you paying attention? She's very funny.
That's what you need as a writer on tour. So the clock is always ticking, and I'm feeling the wings of time beating at my back. And I know, as I said, we set ourselves the impossible task of trying to delve into these very rich books in a very short space of time. We are pretty much out of time, but if there is one very succinct, unlike mine, very succinct question from the audience that someone is just dying for the chance to ask, we have a brief moment now to do that. Anything anyone would like to ask? I know we have some trainees in the audience, and I I feel we may have some Jamaicans. Anything? Anybody?
Wait, where's the Jamaicans in the audience? Okay. Big up yourself. Yes. Yes, let's have a question from the Jamaican in the audience.
My question, my thoughts was more for Ingrid regarding love after love. Yeah, so we're going to take it back a little bit. So I read Love After Love, I think a few years ago, maybe 3-4 years ago. And my question has always been, why did Mr. Cheetah have to die?
Ooh.
Sorry, spoilers, but it came out a while ago.
Thank you very much for asking. So, would it be terrible to say the plot required him to die? Okay, I take it. I've had so many complaints. Okay, it's the one thing everyone says. You know, you shouldn't have allowed him to die, and certainly not violently. But
I kind of felt like, more spoilers, that we got the reunion of the mother and son over his dead body, and it just felt like he became sacrificial for them. So that's how I felt like reading it.
Yeah.
I was like, did he have to die for them to reunite?
I know. You know, the problem is that in fiction we need to tie things up beautifully and things to make sense in a way that they never do in life. So in the book he needed to die. In real life, you know, he could have had a good one.
Yeah, you know, give him a good life ending. Okay, thank you.
I mean, sometimes things don't make sense in real life either. Just
That's
saying, you
true.
know,
No,
just
they
saying.
don't make sense in real life. But we have to make sense of them in literature for people.
Yeah. Some people have questioned the ending of my book, and I'm just like, I'm so sorry that you're questioning my life
Your
choices.
actual life. Well, Ingrid, next time don't write such a compelling character and get people so invested in him. Do a worse job. Everyone, we really are out of time, I'm afraid, but the good news is that we have 3 more writers, poets in this case, who we're going to hear from very shortly. So I'd like 2 things. Number 1 is just to remind you that the books are available for sale outside. Some of you I know have read these books before, some of you haven't. This is your chance to discover them. And the second thing is I just want you to give a round of applause to these 3 writers for coming all this way. I certainly hope it's not the last time they'll be in Madrid, and I certainly hope this is not the last time I'll see your faces in an audience in front of me. Thanks very much, everyone. I think we have a very, very brief break now before we go into the next session.
Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Casa de América and the director of programs, Moises Morera Martin, as well as Marina Salandi Brown and Nicholas Laughlin, there you are, president and program director of the Bocas Lit Festival, respectively, for making this event possible. I would also like to thank the staff of the Franklin Institute for their help in the organization as well. Thank you to all of you, the audience, for being here with us, joining us today for what promises to be a fascinating conversation with these talented poets about their work and experience that they're going to share with us. And of course, thank you to the poets who are here. The title of this panel, of this table, is Self-Portrait as a Poem. So I would like to ask each of you, how is your book a self-portrait? And I know each of you you're going to read some poems. Of course, this one but it's even in the title, so Self-Portrait as Othello. How is Othello a self-portrait of Jason Allen Pesant?
Hi everyone, it's good to see you. Good to be here. It was a wager. The wager was to somehow talk about myself, and Othello through the same prism. Perhaps it was a question that I was trying to answer. What is it that makes me able to see myself, my life, refracted through this Shakespearean character, which is Othello? I guess it was interesting to do the two things at the same time, to sort of read myself into Othello, and to sort of conversely think about Othello, how Othello might continue to be a sort of, what's the word, a kind of archetype that continues to be current. So I hope I've answered the question. The book is called Self-Portrait as Othello because of those reasons. I suppose I was interested in ekphrasis as not just the act of writing about an object, but how could we do an ekphrastic poem by writing into the object, writing. I think when we choose subjects, we often choose them because there is something about ourselves that we find in these objects. There's some sort of connection, and that ekphrastic experiment was about digging out that connection. So.
Okay. You're going to read some poems from this book?
I'll do the first bit.
Okay.
From the first bit. I don't typically, I'm most often standing when I do this, but...
you can stand... You can,
I can use the lectern there. Yeah. Better. I'm 5. I sit on the barbecue, dangling my feet, chewing grass straw like Brother B. Boy following man. My heart races every time a car blows horn or pulls up, thinking, that must be my father, him that come look for me. Yes, him come. The people fly past, and Mama runs to look, and she stares and peers, and the people will not stop flying past, like the whirlwind, like the hurricane. But Daddy was not in the wind. We sit on the barbecue, Brother B and I, twirling grass straws in our mouths, watching the sun go down. You pour out water from the drum into bath pan and tin. The Mento band plucks out a tune in the church below the hill. It's nighttime. Tonight, I will get into the spirit, rise from my body and fly away. Like Mother Pusey when she claps those hands. Each clap sends silence through the galaxy, lifts her through clouds, singing how I got over, falling and rising all these years. I sit on the barbecue, Brother B and I, listening to your drum pan and water. The church below the hill catches the spirit. The body, a thing of weight falling through sky. Tweed jacketed on the terrace of a cocktail bar, a Jamaican country boy, fly as a motherfucker. But look at him though, I just can't. The Prada lenses, fake, straight plastic, same as the day they came out the factory. Him feel expensive, him look fit for the part. At Hilo, the Jamaican eating house, Crazy Andy takes him in to sip rum and listen to Rocksteady. In a version of this story, he manages to come back home to see you before you die, Mama. At Christmas, he's not alone. Instead, that version isn't to happen. Instead, he's reading Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal through the English winter. Among the dreaming spires, you're the truth he runs from. I'm going to Paris, Mama, and I cannot sleep tonight, watching the stars. Night comes untying the cords of my tongue. Rabashundai. The secret place, the void, the bush, Shalama-shundai. I give myself over to a shout, blooming in pain, Rabashundai. The secret place, the bush of Babel. I started speaking French at 13 and pronounced every sound perfectly. The vowels rolled off my tongue and I was untied and I soared away from my body. And in the bush, my mother, she couldn't find me. In the bush, I had a part fit for me. In the bush, shooting bird and going river, something seized me. And every day was a day of Pentecost. My vowels, how they wrapped their arms around me. I'm going to Paris at last, Mama's grandson, and I cannot sleep tonight, watching the stars. Pas de Calais, plumes against my skin. Will I learn to speak here a tongue of loss and forsaking? My mother and father left me, and Mama took me in. The varnish of the fields, a lynx at my heels. Nowhere, and then fourmillante cité. Beside me, Paris, tout d'un coup. I take up my room at the École Normale. I speak the language, but the space don't know my body. A room on the 3rd floor of the internat, 10 square meters, a landscape of speaking voices, nobody in sight, presence of mold in the ceiling, words, incandescent, fine sablure d'un rêve, fleur du mal, flowers blooming in the dark. A damp room on the 3rd floor, École Normale Supérieure. No sound in that hallway, but in my blood. How sharply loneliness cuts the body. My woman walks so dirgefully beside me. I will always be a stranger here. The thing is, the bloody thing is, I didn't realize it, that black was a different language, that poor porous was a different language, that no picket fence, no paper and papa was a different language, that going to the theater every other night, going broke, was my new language to act bourgeois and find my bourgeois style. The plush carpeted Comédie Française, salle Pleyel for music, opera, and theater. No heads like mine to watch Phèdre die. Only one black man in the room who rises from the orchestra to salute me, fist bump, in air. One other black man in the room speaks my language, the language of performer to crowd. And wow, did they like it? The looks. Come on, brethren. My Jamaican brother says to me, black people don't go opera. You know this.
Thank you so much, Jason. I have a question for Anthony. Nature is very present in your book, Polka Dot Wounds. How is nature part of your self-portrait?
Thank you so much for asking that question, and also thank you to everyone who is here tonight, and especially to our very generous hosts. It is a great pleasure to return to Madrid. This is the second time I'm visiting. I would like to begin by returning to something that Jason said in terms of ekphrasis or ekphrasis, which is the response in writing or poetry to a work of art in another medium, particularly a visual work, and also to return to what you said about identifying through a Shakespeare character, in your case Othello. So first I would like to do that. Then in the second place, what I would like to do is question what we mean when we use the word nature. So thank you for your wonderfully provocative question. So in the first place, I would consider that one of the qualities of ekphrasis as practiced in the modern world is that we, as moving, embodied creatures, contemplate a still or fixed image, And what for me is fascinating in the work that Jason has just read is that you speak, Jason, of yourself as a performer, and you have a moment of identification with the performer in the orchestra when you are also a spectator at the opera. So I have to refuse ekphrasis or ekphrasis in terms of my relation to nature, because I identify as one creature among many creatures, one in a species perhaps called human, but one of the poems in my book is simply entitled Small Thing at Play. I never specify what kind of creature the small thing is. What matters is that unlike a portrait and unlike in a performer, it is in a playful motion. Secondly, then, or rather, secondly, the idea that we should identify ourselves or refract ourselves through a character by Shakespeare, I would like to reject the character of Hamlet. Because, you see, Hamlet talks to himself. The play is so much other people witnessing Hamlet talking to himself. And I would be terrified to create a self-portrait in which I am talking to myself. What I would rather do is create a portrait of a place. The Guyanese writer, Martin Carter, the Guyanese revolutionary writer, Martin Carter, 1927 to 1997, wrote a poem about listening to the land and the tongueless whispering of those who had gone before. And that kind of listening to a place and the whispering emanating from the buried or the voiceless or the shadowed or the shadowless, that is what I would want to do. So then, in terms of the idea of what I actually do in my book, you will notice that there's a picture of St. Francis of Assisi on the cover, San Francisco de Assis, which was not actually my choice. But what is very interesting is that he received the wounds, the stigmata of Christ. So this figure has bleeding wounds. But the idea of that blood is not traumatic. The idea is that the blood is nourishing. And so I would like to consider that even in a landscape we are wounding, what we call nature, we are not separate from, and we are in an interconnected relationship with it, one which can be nourishing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And you're going to be reading?
Yes, I think I will imitate Jason and stand up to read. You know, we need a lot of air as poets. This poem is called Scales of Loss and Longing, and that is scales in the musical sense. And I composed this poem during the quarantine in Scotland, when there was snow for 6 weeks in Edinburgh that never melted. And it is a dialogue between a person walking along the seacoast and having an imaginary conversation with somebody 400 or 500 miles away. Scales of loss and longing. I walked to the lighthouse with you, all of you who are absent, and I said, the face of the moon soon would be ploughed up. And you said, conscious of the Queen of Heaven, the moon doesn't have a face. And I said to you, presently, the moon would be furrowed in a way you could see from Earth. And then we looked half absently at the ruby cloud ingathering, and the tactless moon encroached upon us, endeared itself to us, displaced in time from us, exploitable in names like ours. And I said, exactly because you aren't here, walking past the old chained pier, which is shut, and are you hurrying into a sleepy pleat? I said, when I can't see, I hear the lift in your voice. When I can't hear, I feel the lift in your form. when I can't feel, I sense the lift in your heart. I say it walking with you when you, absent, perhaps not walking, reply, the face, the lighthouse, some harmony, the moon.
Thank you, Anthony. Hannah, your book, The Kids, presents a reflection of childhood and nostalgia and memories and family. How is this part of your self-portrait?
I'll put myself on the front of the book, you know, I'm there with the bad fringe. And, you know, I think all of my work is in some way a self-portrait, although it's kind of always hiding. You know, it's different poetry from memoir. It doesn't enter what they call the autobiographical pact, which is the agreement between the writer and the reader that I will tell you as far as I can remember what is true. But poetry is a slightly sort of different space where you don't have to tell the truth. And I think, and yeah, I've striven to kind of tell something about myself through my work. And a lot of it goes back to my father, who was Jamaican, he was Afro-Chinese, and he died when I was 21, having never really spoken about his life growing up with his Chinese father in Jamaica, or about his migration, his early years in London. I was just thinking my dad would be 100 next year. So he was really from a different time and space. And when he died, I was galvanized into trying to recoup some of that story, some of the Caribbean to China. But a lot of that was about the way I look. As a kid, you know, my dad would turn up to pick me up. He was old for a start. He was also a professional gambler and often just rolled out of bed to pick me up from school. And he was black. And kids saying, you know, who's that old man? And sometimes I just say, don't know, like cab driver. And even as an adult, you know, when I lived in Brixton, in the heart of the Caribbean diaspora in London, there used to be a Jamaican guy on my street every day, washing his car. And I'd come downstairs and he'd say, "Oh, hey, Polish, to me. And it went on for weeks, you know. And then one day I turned around and I said, "No, actually, I'm Jamaican." He went, "You sure?" You know, so, but I think, I'm joking, but a lot of my writing has been trying to talk about not being what I'm seen as being. And I didn't do it deliberately in writing. It wasn't my agenda to do that, but I wanted to write about my father, my memories of him, my childhood. In relation to him, he was always off to see a man about a dog. But of course, The Kids isn't about that. My previous books, and yet it sort of still is. The Kids is about my life as a teacher in a sixth form. Soon after my father died, I qualified to become a teacher in a very multicultural, working class sixth form college, and the kids, or my students, taught me so much about my own identity, about the legacies of empire, how alive and well they still are, the politics of social class and gender in the classroom. And so that was the self-portrait is really of myself as a teacher, but it's still me all the way, you know.
Oh yeah, students open our minds many times and teach us a lot also. Okay, you're going to read...
I'll read a couple of, because they're sonnets, the whole book is sonnets, so I'll just read two. So at the sixth form, when I first started then, I was so young, I was only a few years older than my students. I didn't even have an English degree either, which is and I was meant to be teaching English literature. But often we'd have these debates, you know, about Englishness or Britishness, and what it meant. And the students, there were very few white kids I taught. They were all from, you know, all around the world. It was so global, from Africa, the Caribbean, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and then at the time I was teaching Eastern Europe as well. And some of them were like second, third generation. And yet if you ask them about Englishness, they go, "No, I'm not English, I'm Ghanaian," or I'm, you know, whatever. Except when they went to Ghana and then they were British, you know, in the eyes of the Ghanaians. So But the poems that I'm going to read to you, I'll read two. The first one is called The Only English Kid, the 1 year that I only had one white student. The Only English Kid. When the debate got going on Englishness, I'd pity the only English kid. Poor Johnny in his spotless Reeboks and blue Fred Perry. He had a voice from history, dunno miss, yes miss, no miss, all treacly cockney, rag and bone. And while the others claimed Poland, Ghana, Bulgaria, and shook off England like the wrong team's shirt, John brewed his tea exclusively on Holloway Road. So when Asif mourned the George Cross banner swinging freely like a warning from his neighbour's roof, the subway tunnel sprayed with Muslim scum, poor John would sit there quietly, looking guilty for all the awful things he hadn't done. And I'll also read a poem. So when I didn't have an English degree, kind of deliberately I'd studied American literature to kind of read outside of the canon, which is also to do with my father, because I was interested in him, although you'd had to hit me over the head with a hammer for me to know that at 18, 19. And then when I began teaching, I was often having to teach things I knew nothing about, like only be a week ahead of the students, like teaching the Restoration. Didn't have the internet then. What is the Restoration? And I had very little cultural capital because I'm the first in my family to go to university. So I did grow up in a house of books, but they were all like socialist and communist books, and so I didn't know some of the things that other teachers would know. And then we moved location from this quite rough working class area to Islington in London, which is quite posh, and all of a sudden we started getting middle class students, and that posed some challenges to me. So I'm sure the learned audience know that the Restoration diarist who wrote about the Great Fire of London, his name is Samuel Pepys, but it's not spelt like what it sounds. But I did not know that when I was teaching. Pepys. The posh girls came and took a corner table, all lip gloss and ribbony hair, and each with a fan of starry GCSEs and a summer of youth hostels in Europe behind them, and the future wide open to them like a rainbow parasol, or so I thought. It was Restoration comedies, and I was reading the class an essay, and though I'd seen his name, I'd never heard it. Pepys, I said, Pepys, over and over, until one girl spoke up. Do you mean Pepys? She said, her voice pulled taut as a noose, as if I were the girl and she the teacher. And what could I have said? I read on. Pepys, Pepys, Pepys. Cool as a trickster, ridiculous as the fool. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Well, you all come from diverse and different cultural backgrounds, but you share a search for identity, as we have you just answered the question, or on your self-portrait as a poem in your books. You also share a search for, or thoughts on diaspora, memory, history, and I would like to ask you, is there a sense of responsibility to your cultural heritage in your writings? Any of you?
Well, I'll have a go. Okay. What is that cultural heritage? Yes, there is cultural heritage, and it's important to talk about that. But I think it's also important to have the possibility of being of not necessarily being tethered to writing about a cultural heritage. I know it's a sort of contradictory thing. My book, this book, Self-Portrait as Othello, a lot of it is talking about wanting to to resist the imperative of being one thing. It's there are references to flying away and to being multiple. I think that's certainly one thing that I see in Othello. He is in Venice, which we know at the time, in the Renaissance era, is a melting pot. It's very culturally diverse and effervescent. And this dark-skinned man ends up there, and he's a general, and he's getting involved with the politics of state and all of that. And I think it was important to look at this figure outside of the Shakespearean prism, to think, where does he come from, to speculate about where might he have come from, what might his mother tongue have been. I think I somehow see, I somehow associated him with multiplicity, a sort of person who is, and as black people are often today, black immigrants, there's an impulse to want to tie us down to a single identity, a single set of narratives and so on. And I just want to fly, you know. I came to Europe with a hungriness, that a sort of sense that I already belonged here, you know, that I already was here. Perhaps a lot of that is colonialism and history. And I think this is why I resist writing about identity, you know. It's sort of like a double bind, because so I think we're imprisoned in identity. So I often feel imprisoned. I often feel like consigned to my identity. And, you know, why does that have to be, you know? I don't want to be the writer, the sort of writer who is like consigned to their identity, to have to write as a Caribbean writer with Caribbean tropes. You know, what are those? You know, we have often these ready-made ideas about what a Caribbean poem is meant to sound like, you know. But I think the Caribbean moves, you know. I think intrinsically, essentially, we always are moving into other spaces. And I think we've got to embrace that. I suppose that toggles back to the theme, you know, of why we're here, the theme that's today's theme.
Does this mean fragmentation? Do you find unity in fragmentation, or is there something else? Are you looking for unity?
I don't experience fragmentation. To me, moving and mobility is a joy.
Yes.
There's a joy in being multiple things. There's a hungriness,
from
an eagerness that I think is ours. That we deserve it.
Yes.
You know. You know. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you. You're also. Would anybody like to say something?
Yes, just a footnote, really. Just a footnote, which I'm very fascinated by. I am very fascinated by the theories of créolité and the writings, for example, of Edouard Glissant. And I believe that one of the great gifts of this meeting of the Caribbean and the Hispanophone world is the ability to exchange, to fuse, to alchemize. And I would see that what happens in the Bocas Lit Fest, even in the name Bocas Lit Fest, which is named for the Boca del Dragón and Boca del Serpiente, two channels of water in the sea of Trinidad and Tobago, I would see that what happens there is a model for the possibilities of our exchange, our future intercambio.
I could say something about it. Was the responsibility
of to your cultural heritage? Do you find any sense of responsibility that you have to?
I don't know that responsibility is the right word, but it's definitely like a very tricky subject for me. I was born in Britain, you know, and a big part of my identity is British, and even within that, my mum's side, there's a regional identity, which is Essex, and a social class identity, which is working class. I've traced that back. You know, my mum's ancestors were Huguenot, another sort of persecuted minority that came from France. So, but it's sometimes funny that we sort of treat whiteness and Englishness, at least in Britain, as the kind of neutral space, and the Caribbean as the not neutral space. But I actually feel a sort of responsibility, or kind of set of ethics around writing about both. Always asking, how much can I write about Jamaica, that, you know, the place that I was not born, and so much responsibility in the kind of nuances of that, writing about the Chinese in Jamaica, who are not a well-documented community. So what is my role and responsibility, or what can I even say? And it's not helpful that my Chinese grandfather, ticks every stereotype of a Chinese man that exists, apart from smoking opium. But, you know, gambling, like womanizing in Jamaica at least. So I'm always sort of pulling between not wanting to stereotype, but also wanting to write what I know to be true, willing to ask the bigger questions. But yeah, I wear those responsibilities hugely.
Well, meaning there is some sort of feeling of belonging, like of where do you belong, or what are you? What part of this is you, and what other part is also you? Do you have to commit to both?
Commit to them all, like Jason. I mean, we can't
I know.
put ourselves in a pie chart, although that's actually what DNA testing does, isn't it? If anyone's ever done DNA testing, you see your, you know, your ancestral DNA on a pie chart. But our lived experience is so completely different from that, and yeah, enriched by its multiplicity. But with that comes, because I sometimes think, you know, when you meet people in Britain that are solidly, like, say, upper middle class, like, what's that awful politician, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was on the radio talking about Windrush, and he said, those people that came on the Windrush, they've got as much right to Englishness as I have, and I can chase my family back 1,000 years in Somerset. And I thought, like, how, like, stable you must feel, like, emotionally, psychologically, to be able to trace your ancestry 1,000 years back in Somerset, you know, compared to the sort of negotiations and discoveries that someone like me has had to do. Yeah.
Sorry, if I could just footnote that as a former medievalist, if I traced my ancestry 1,000 years back to Somerset, I would feel deeply unsettled. Not only because the Middle Ages in England were a time of great creolization and invasions, but also because Somerset was the county where the accent was used as the accent for stupid people up to Shakespeare's time. Yes, so this is really a very unsettling identification.
Another topic that you share. Oh, sorry. Another topic that you share is diaspora. I wanted to ask you, beyond physical location, do you find that there are metaphysical or emotional homes that you seek in your writings? I know.
Language, metaphysical homes. Was that your line?
Emotional homes, metaphysical, something different from not just the physical place where you think you belong, or you want to stay, or you want to live.
I think language is a metaphysical home for me.
Okay.
It's a sort of sanctuary. It's a way of being expansive, and I've spoken already, mentioned already this idea of being more in the Fanonian vein, you know, this imperative that we we have. It confronts us of being more than our epidermis, more than. I think language offers those vistas that makes us feel bigger, that makes us feel powerful. Your language makes me feel empowered, you know. And I think that's quite a metaphysical positioning. Yeah.
And I think very much of Kamau Brathwaite, the great philosopher and visionary poet from Barbados, and his dialectic theory and practice, which of course is a play on the word dialectic, but begins with a reference to the tides, because Kamau's poetics were environmental, with the movement of the ocean bringing things back and forth, literally environmental, but also metaphysically, and also influenced by West African spirituality. So what I would see there is that poets who physically have a home near water also have a metaphysical home in fluidities and crossings.
Would you like to say something?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the metaphysical home, but I think if you talk to any writer that has taken their work seriously, like over a long period of time, for me, it's where there is magic in the world. You know, I grew up. I actually grew up in a. My dad was such a kind of committed atheist. It was like a sort of a religion in itself, my dad's atheism. But my brother, my older brother, was very, very spiritual, but I was always kind of excluded from his incense burning antics. Still don't quite know what he was getting up to. But I sort of entered like a very rational world of activist politics, you know, protest, and it's very secular. It felt very secular. But I always wanted like magic, and writing, particularly poetry, but also I think writing with kind of the historical excavations that I've done. And I'm sure most writers will say this feeling that you write something, you're sort of very deeply in it, and then you go away and you come back and you think, who was here? You know, who was just sitting in my chair, because that wasn't this self, you know, the one that's just been to Lidl. Yeah, so I don't know if it answers the metaphysical aspect, but certainly the spiritual aspect of writing is something I know, and in so many conversations I've had with writers, you know, that's something we kind of talk about as well.
That's very important. That's very beautifully said and posed. Okay. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I think it would be better if we could have the authors reading again at least one poem. Is there time? I think there's time for that. And then I will ask the audience to ask any questions that you might have. But I think poetry is communicated and felt better when it's read out loud. I think we get the sense of the feeling, and a lot more when you read it, and much more if it's read by the authors. So, Jason.
On the Ponte di Rialto, I watch myself glide on distances of times and seas. Rialto shivers like the lagoon's contours, like the dream of marble in my veins. Waves gliding to the distant country, and back to this bridge, to the country where I first learnt the name Rialto through Shakespeare taught in a Jamaican tongue, where I let it ring, echo, and disappear into time. Now I come and find it real, La Serenissima. My senses soar like the flame in Bellini's reds, like the curling flames of Tiziano and Giorgione, Tiepolo and Tintoretto, the light over the Canal Grande, il paese che un dì sognai, già a lungo tempo lo cercai, between houses whose walls never tire of the water's tongue, rapimento of skirts, the air filled with mosaics, tesserae of dreams, how they move thronging this city around whose corners the mind turns endlessly, never tiring, each lapping of the lagoon's tongue, a page, tessera dei miei sogni.
Jason and Hannah are two of the poets whom I would love to sit and listen to. This poem was commissioned by the Royal Society of Literature to commemorate the Windrush generation, so-called, and the title of it, Turn and Live, is a quote from the book of Ezekiel. I know this is a secular institution, but Ezekiel was a prophet who pointed out the land is covered with blood, and I believe that Caribbean poets often take up a prophetic role. Turn and live. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. Windrush is the name of a ship, not of a generation. Windrush is the name of a ship, not of any situation. Windrush is the witchcraft name of a ship waterlining us into uncharted, obligatory, and perpetual migration. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. The naming of ships is a terrible thing, the terrible mother tell me. I came in a ship called Threat Vector. I came in a ship called Dust to Dust. Who came in a ship called Willing Ambassador? Who came in a ship called Evidence of Funds? Did I dance with you on the blue carpet? Was your ship called the Providence, the Invitation? Was your ship called Guerrilla Diplomacy? Go back where you came from, citizens, says terrible motherland, whether that means overseas or going back under the sea. Citizens, life forms. Listen to the lady. She is a consultant anonymizer, a high mobility native of Fortress Trolley. We are phantasmagorically, primarily and politically, lightless and all-bearing creatures, put down, not undrowned, gone beyond, beyond drowned. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. A woman is sweeping the sea, in the father's words, in Kamau's words. A woman is sweeping the sea. They still say in English, a ship is a she. Who says so? The ship is a thing of itness, witness, and creator, fury of a wake, raking over of witness. The island scholar is sweeping the carpet in her London digs, sweeping the sea grey, the pea super carpet in no blacks, no Irish, no dogs London's aspirational digs. That carpet had etiquette. It demanded her to accept it in its misty itness as grey, grey like ethical practice, dove or pigeon grey. Could the island scholar trust loose-talking fibre after she studied the French liberator Charles de Gaulle, who dismissed our archipelago as specks of dust? She sweeps and a pattern emerges, stabilizing as many colors, stabilizing as a miracle, a many-colored pattern wanting to dance beside her feet, after she was forced to breathe in dust, settling and unsettling, the miracle of many colors. The sacrifice got up off the altar. Become an archaeologist of your lungs. Thank you, and I dedicate my reading to my beloved brother in poetry, Yusuf M. Kazmieh.
And I also wanted to say my deep thanks for everyone that's made this trip here possible, Nicholas and Marina and everyone. But this poem's actually for you, Jason, because it's about Othello, but it doesn't actually say it in the poem. We used to take our students to the theatre, and we'd like 40 tickets or 60 tickets. We'd get these discounted tickets, and we'd take them to see Shakespeare, all kinds of things. And lots of my students had been to the theatre, and a lot had never been to the theatre ever. And they'd say, like, what happens in the interval? And I'd say, well, you can get some ice cream, but it's quite expensive, so you might want to bring a snack. And I remember sort of looking down the aisle at 12th night, and they had like Tupperwares of fried chicken, 2-litre bottles of Tizer. They were like getting well stuck in. But once the biggest theatre trip I ever took students to was to see Othello. And we took 100 students, and a teacher was ill, so there were only 2 of us. There's 50 students each. And my colleague said, this is more like bloody dog walking than teaching. And that is how the poem begins, the sixth form theatre trip. You've got more dogs than you can count, big dogs and small. One badass dog in headphones mooching up the aisle. A dog who smuggled in a hot dog. 2 loving dogs back row already smooching. Some dogs are up on haunches barking. A dog or 2 already dozing, heads in paws, dog sighing and dreaming. The other theatre dogs look down their snouts, a pair of tutting chow-chows, some slony poodles in the box. But when the curtains lift, and your dogs are hypnotised, their ears like little hoisted sails, the wag of their tails, their shining dog hearts flung wide open. They know these words, these lines, memorised like buried bones. And don't you love your dogs?
I don't think we have any time, but I'm going to take just a couple of minutes. If somebody has a question, only one question from the audience. I think her.
So there's a quote that I love by Marcus Garvey, and it's, "A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots." But as we discussed tonight, we can't always trace our families back thousands of years, or there are times we can't, or we don't want to be constrained by our history and culture. So then, while writing these poems, what were some things that grounded you to yourself, help you discover who you are, how you want to communicate your thoughts, your feelings?
Anybody would like to answer?
Yeah, that's like a question about grounding. Especially when writing quite like difficult material. I don't know. I mean, I always say to my students, like, you think that writing is all about your brain and your page and your pen, but actually, you need to use your body. And I say all kinds of strange things to them, like you must walk. I do yoga, a lot of yoga. I swim a lot. I edit poems while swimming, and all of those things are part of my writing practice. I also try to grow things, not very well. I try to grow vegetables, what I read when I'm not writing poetry, I read novels. Because I'm not doing it, so I'm always sort of looking to find some relief in reading things that I'm not got no skin in the game with yet. So yeah. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but just talking about some of the ways in which, grounding practices. You probably have more interesting things to say.
No, not really. I mean, I wanted to continue with the point that Hannah makes, that we are embodied beings, and writing is also a bodily practice. And one thing I have learned as I got older is the importance of sleeping, because I, in fact, write better if I have slept rather than if I have been awake for 36 or 48 hours, which is a mood in which Nicholas Lachlan has known me to appear at festivals. and I have to thank him for his great patience. Do sleep. It's important.
Yeah, I think I don't have anything much. First of all, thank you for your question. I don't think I have anything much. I don't know really. Besides, I agree. Besides what you've points that you two have made. Yeah, I probably wasn't very grounded while I wrote this book. No.
He was fantastically dressed, though. Is that part of it? I was thinking
no, but that's not grounding. I mean,
this is very grounding. I think look wonderful.
I mean, I do think. So my first book, what grounded me there was going for walks in the woods and the forests and those spaces that I write about in the book. And so the subject matter itself was the grounding, right? It was talking about what it is to sort of like imagine black subjectivities and black lives in these kind of like nature spaces in a way that perhaps we weren't. I was feeling at the time we weren't imagined so much. We weren't imagined so much there, and in the literature that accompanies it. So it was sort of like a reclamation to say, like, my body is here in these places, and I can be lazy, and I don't have to be doing stuff. I can just be going for walks in the middle of the day, the working day, which was a revolutionary act for me. So, yeah, that was a grounding kind of experience, but this, yeah.
Just one other thing like that. I've been thinking a lot about this recently, having just finished a book. Writing is so solitary, and we're social animals. And I do think that the writer's life is a hard one because of that. Because we need people, and so for me, it's always trying to get that balance right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there another quick question? Could we fit one in? Or?
Yeah.
I just wondered, we talked a lot about, it's sort of a complicated question and it's not. We talked a lot about culture tonight and even metaphysics at one point. And there were some allusions to politics as well. And I wondered whether, particularly with the Windrush poem, but I wondered if you thought, to what extent you thought those things could be related to the poetic act itself, whether to what extent they could be separated or related. Sort of more colloquially, what headspace are you in when you're writing your poems? Are you thinking about those things, or are you thinking about the poetry itself?
I'm sorry, we only have time for one answer.
So very, very quickly, I'm always interested by the word political, because for me the most political poem which exists, and I do not understand the headspace in which it is written, is one where a white, cis, heterosexual English man walks in the woods without fear of being shot and falls in love with a woman who does not know him and is not reported to the police and then is published and paid money for this. I find this an extraordinary political poem, and I do not understand the headspace.
Well, thank you so much for your generosity in sharing with us your thoughts, feelings, and experiences. And thank you to Casa de América for such a wonderful event. I hope we can have much more events like this more often than just 20 years apart. So thank you everyone for being here and staying until this hour. Thank you.